Hello everyone. This video is a little bit late today. I was supposed to be yesterday for Shabbat, but I ran out of time yesterday, and so I'm doing it today. So anyways, we're going to go through Parashah 13, which is Shemot, which in English means names. Remember that beginning of each Parashah, and also the beginning of each of the books of the Torah, are named after the first significant word or words um, in the text. So let's go ahead and get started. Parashah 13. We are picking up with in Exodus, which also in Hebrew is for Hebrew it's Shemot, which means names. We call it Exodus in English. But we are going to pick up after Joseph has passed away, and a whole generation has passed away. So now we're many, many years into the future. A lot has happened between then and now, and so we're going to get into how that's kind of recapsulated um, in the beginning of Shemot, and then move on from there. So let's get started. All right, so we are starting in Shemot or Exodus chapter 1. And so the first few verses, I've wrote versions there by accident, excuse me. The first few verses sum up the end of Bereshit and how much Israel has grown. Israel has grown very, very much. They have become a multitude in Egypt. And so Joseph and all of his generation, all his brothers, they were all passed away and gone. And so now it's their children and their children's children, all there. Like I said, they've really exploded. They're up to 600,000 males. And so if you take into consideration that's probably a little bit more than that in females, and then also children, you're probably talking, maybe about, upwards of 6 million, possibly, that are living in Egypt. That is truly a multitude of people. So some questions here. Why didn't Israel want to leave? Before the enslavement started, they were doing well. They survived the famine. Joseph had passed away, and all his brothers. And so now that leads us to our second question. So it could be simply that maybe they liked the lifestyle they had there. Maybe they liked the stability of having. Remember Goshen, where they settled in Goshen, that was like prime land. That was like the best land in all of Egypt. So they moved in as guests and basically got the best part of Egyptian land. It's in the Nile Delta. It was very fertile. They were able to plant and do all kind of things there that most of the Egyptians were not able to do in the rest of the country. Remember, most of the country of Egypt is very desert-like, very wilderness-like, and so only the area along the Nile, and especially the Nile Delta, is conducive to actually doing agriculture. Now, of course, they could take water from the Nile and transport it to wherever they want to actually grow crops, but it probably wouldn't be very far from the Nile Delta. And there was irrigation and things, but again, it wouldn't have been that far from the Nile Delta. Now, the Nile Delta was the heart of agriculture for Egypt and of actually growing food. So that could have been one very good reason of why they didn't leave. They had it good there. The Pharaoh that was with Joseph treated them pretty nicely. Joseph took care of them. Now Joseph and them are gone, but they're still living in a very nice area. They're still growing. They're still prospering. And so maybe that's one reason why they didn't leave. Now, the other reason could be that Pharaoh didn't want them to leave. Remember, when they came to Egypt, even though they were guests, Pharaoh basically, in his mind, they're now part of Egypt. They're actually owned owned in respect by Egypt and by Pharaoh. And so now that they're in, Pharaoh may not just want them to leave. Now we've got hints of that with what happened with Joseph and Yaakov's funeral, um, where it was hinted at that only because of the uh, the oath he took with Yaakov was he able to leave and bury his father. Otherwise, he may not have been able to leave. And this is probably the same case, maybe with Israel. It's even with that, even with past pharaohs, um, that they were not. Once they came to Egypt, they were viewed as part of Egypt. Um, Not only that, but it is pretty evident that Pharaoh knew they were all the blessings and all the benefits that they were getting because of Israel's presence, and so they didn't want them to leave. Now, what else happened during this time? Um, so after the time of Joseph and his brothers, and before Moshe appeared on the scene, um, it's kind of hinted at that there was a growing change of how the Egyptians looked at the Israelites. At first, they were welcome. They were glad they were there. Now, remember, they weren't very happy. They were herdsmen and those with flocks. That's an important thing to Egyptians. But at the same time, um, the um, the children of Israel were respected. Um, Yaakov himself was looked at as a very great man. Um, Joseph, of course, was governor of all of Egypt, and then so there was a um, high opinion of the children of Israel at that time. Now, as time went along, and they grew and they grew, and they became more influential, and they started to really almost outnumber the native Egyptians. That started to change. And so, not only that, but you also had a clash of belief systems because um, the children of Yaakov worshipped and followed um, Adonai, whereas the Egyptians had a whole pantheon of gods they followed. And so this monotheism versus these polytheism probably was also another point of contention. The other question, and it's something that's hinted at later on throughout the rest of the Tanakh, or the Old Testament scriptures, is that Israel had been influenced by Egyptian culture and beliefs. They came out with idols. They still had an idol worshiping mindset, hence with the golden calf incident. They also viewed God as not one without form and a spirit. They viewed God as they put him in the form of an animal, which is probably what they were used to seeing to respect back in Egypt. So they had that, and it also talks about in the rest of the Tanakh, whereas where that Egypt was never they took Israel out of Egypt, but they never really took Egypt out of Israel, and that was a problem. That now there are I know I'm kind of getting on the weeds here, but there are beliefs that it was not the people of Israel who started the problems in the wilderness, but it was it was the mixed multitude, was those that came out with them that stirred up trouble and caused issues. That very well could be a valid claim, and it could be. But whenever God punished the people, he punished them all as a whole. He didn't just separate and punish those that were not children of Yaakov. He punished all of the people, and I don't think that God would punish all of them if only a subset of them were involved, especially since it was not their leadership involved. Moshe was not involved. Usually the elders were not involved. And so if that was true, you would have thought that it would just been it would just have been the subset of those mixed multitude that got punished. But no, God punished all of them. So, which means that Israel was culpable in whatever the rest of them were doing, if in fact it was only the mixed multitude that caused the issue. in any way, in the prophets, in the and things of that nature, it talks about that Israel never really got away from what they learned in Egypt, what they were exposed to in Egypt, and then also later on by beliefs and culture and paganist things that happened to that they were confronted with and exposed to um, in the land of Israel and in surrounding nations. Okay, so enough about that. Let's go ahead and go further. So a new Pharaoh rose that did not know Joseph. So the Pharaoh that had at least been benevolent to Joseph and Israel and the rest of Israel was gone. Okay, and the one who took his place knew nothing about Joseph. Now this is interesting because usually the next Pharaoh was the firstborn or one of Pharaoh's sons. However, and you would think that because of that, that Pharaoh's son would know who Joseph was and and why Joseph was who he was, why he was governor, why Pharaoh allowed his Joseph's brothers to come to Egypt. They would have known all this. However, this Pharaoh did not know Joseph. Now, it begs a question: if Pharaoh did not know Joseph, then was he really part of the prior Pharaoh's family? There's an argument made that this Pharaoh right now, was one that took over from another family altogether who did not know Joseph. And so because of that, he saw them more as a threat than anything else. So he saw the people of Israel as a threat, did not know Joseph, and so that's why we start getting into this thing of slavery, because there was, like I said, the Pharaoh did not know Joseph, did not know the relationship the prior Pharaoh had with him, did not know all the good Joseph did for them. All he saw was a people that were not Egyptian, that were growing to a point that were going to outnumber the Egyptians, and all he was afraid of was losing his power. That's all he was afraid of. All right, so getting to that, so Egypt had off and on again conflicts with various peoples in the Middle East, including the land of what will be the land of Israel. They had conflicts with different Canaanite people. They had conflicts with the Midianites. They had conflicts with a lot of different groups. And so Egypt was always afraid or ready for some kind of war to happen. Now, when this Pharaoh saw that Israel had become so big, and because of where they came from, you can naturally make the connections there that all he saw was that if Egypt got invaded by people from Canaan, that Israel would be more inclined to side with the Canaanites than they would with the Egyptians. And that was Pharaoh's basis for what he did. It was purely survival. It was purely staying in power. Okay? Remember, to Pharaoh, power was everything. And that's because to the gods they worshipped, power was everything. And they considered Pharaoh a god. So, slavery was Pharaoh's answer. We want to keep them here. We don't want to kill them all off. We want to keep them here to keep getting the benefits from them. But we want to keep them utterly in control. so that they can't revolt. So they did that. They put harsh taskmasters over them. They put them under brutal work conditions to kind of smother them to where they weren't having as many children. Some of them started dying off, and their numbers dwindled, but not to the point to where they didn't have them around to keep doing all their work for them. So now, when Israel got put to work, they did not get to build palaces or pyramids. Okay, those were made with large, huge granite stones. They were put over with very beautiful decorations. They were put a very highly reflective stone over top of the granite. These were beautiful places. This is not what Israel got to build. They got to build ordinary storage cities. And so and they did not get to build them. They got to build them right where they lived. So it wasn't like they traveled inland or away from the Nile to go build these pyramids and palaces. That's not what they did. They were right there. They stayed right close to home and built these storage cities. These storage cities were for for food you put in for the rest of Egypt. And so and you can tell that these storage cities were the ones they were built because the Israelites used brick to make them. Now, again, if you look at the rest of the palaces and pyramids, other elaborate buildings that were built in Egypt, they were not made with brick. Only your ordinary buildings were made with brick. And so Israel was basically building these buildings simply to put food in that they would probably never see. And it doesn't say in the word, but I'm pretty sure they probably had other Israelites that were actually farming in addition to building these buildings. So they built the buildings to store the food in. They were being slaves to actually plant and give to the rest of the Egyptian society. That's kind of a salt in the wound. Not only are we actually slaves, providing the rest of Egypt with food, but now we're also building the buildings that will store this food for the rest of Egypt. Okay, so regardless of what Pharaoh put on them, Israel did persevere. They continued to grow, even no matter how harshly they worked them. Actually, a matter of fact, the harder they worked them, the more Israel continued to grow. It's kind of a hint there, and kind of a very frustrating point for Pharaoh that he's got to be thinking to himself, no matter how hard I work these guys, they continue to persevere and they continue to grow as far as how many people they have among them. And so that leads Pharaoh to his next resolution. Okay, so Pharaoh, desperate to keep Israel from growing and overwhelming them, decides to go ahead and have all baby boys to be killed. They're to be killed at the point they're born. So he calls the midwives in, and there's a lot of Hebrew women. We don't know if these two midwives he called in were the chief over all the midwives, or maybe the only midwives available. It's kind of hard to believe that for millions of people, for millions of women, there were only two midwives among them to go around delivering babies. And anyways, Pharaoh commands them that when the babies are born, if they're a boy, kill them. If they're a girl, let them live. The midwives did not follow the command of Pharaoh, and actually Pharaoh got mad and said, "Hey, I told you to do this. Why haven't you done it?" Now envision that when they're called in, they're probably fearful for their lives. Pharaoh has the power to have them executed immediately, especially since these are Hebrew midwives. They're not from Egypt. They're Hebrews who Pharaoh already hates. So the midwives say, "Hey, these are Hebrews. They're not like Egyptians. They birth really fast, their children, and we don't even have time to get there before they're birthed." And so God blesses the midwives with children of their own because of their refusal to do what evil and refusal to do what Pharaoh asked them to do. Now that brings Pharaoh to one up what he told about the baby boy. So now it's not just the midwife's job to go ahead and kill them. Now it's also all of Egypt's job to kill them. So now all of the people of Egypt are to, whenever they find a baby boy of Israel, to go ahead and throw him into the river. And this implicates all of Egypt's culpability and all of their all of their guilt in what happened to Israel even further. So now it's not even just slavery; now it's murder for all of Egypt. Okay, so now there's an irony come up here. So the Nile is full of crocodiles, Nile crocodiles, and so you can imagine when the boys were tossed in, if they didn't drown, they were eaten and other horrible things. However, what's really interesting is that Moses, who's about to be born and talked about here and takes center stage, um, actually was put into the Nile on purpose, survived, and so it's interesting that the very river that was taking the lives of these boys ended up actually bringing actually almost like being saved, almost like being born again out of the Nile, because and we'll get into it, but you'll see the kind of imagery here, but actually the Nile ends up giving life, as in giving Moshe back, to actually undo what all the Egyptian people have done. It's very ironic. So let's move on. So in chapter 2, we start actually getting into the life of young Moshe. Okay, so Moshe, when he was born, he was hidden for 3 months by his mother. Now, both his mother and his father were both um, of the tribe of Levi or Levi. Okay, and so he's hidden for 3 months, and finally gets to the point to where his mother just cannot hide him any longer. Um, he's he's bigger. He is probably louder. Um, he's starting to to go more towards becoming a toddler than he actually is an infant, and all the things that actually come with that. So eventually, his mother had to Jochebed. It doesn't say that in the first chapter, but her name was Jochebed. Had to make a decision. So she had to. Excuse me, my children are making noise in the background. I apologize. She had to put Moshe in a basket, and she had to get him out of the house. Otherwise, they were going to find him and kill him. Um, it's possible that Moshe's parents knew his mission and what he was supposed to do, and that may be why they decided to put him in a basket in a plate. Now get this. So here's the faith that Moshe's mom had. So she puts him in a basket, crudely made basket, and then she puts him in the very place where other baby boys are being killed or being murdered. Okay? That takes a lot of faith. You're putting your child in a basket in a place where other baby boys are being killed, probably as she did it. And so to do that took a lot of faith. It's also possible that the place she put Moshe in on purpose was right where the Pharaoh's daughter happened to bathe. Now, it could just be happenstance where he got put, but it seems awful suspicious. I mean, they had to have known this is where Pharaoh's daughter goes to bathe. And so putting him there, it just seems like it was very purposeful. So perhaps God had already talked with her or shown her in a dream or something to where to actually put him. Where he'd be safe. And maybe she did at that point know exactly that Moshe was special and something was going to happen with him. So, whether on purpose or not, he was placed right where Pharaoh's daughter bathed. Um, Now, Moshe's sister, interesting enough, Moshe's sister hid and stayed behind to see what would happen to him. Why would she do that? If she didn't, if he was put in there just, you know, and hopefully that he'd survive, and they didn't want to see what happened to him. They would have went ahead and hid and not seen. She went back home to her mother. They probably would have praying and crying, hoping that Moshe was safe somehow, and ended up somewhere safe. Um, that's not what happened here. Her sister deliberately stayed behind to see what would happen to him. So it might have been, known throughout Moshe's family that this was a plan to do. This is why the plan had happened. God was the one who actually caused, who gave him the idea to do this, where to put him, and so his sister stayed behind to actually see what would happen. So when Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe, she saw the basket and she opened it and saw the child crying. So um, So she instantly took pity on it. She knew it was a Hebrew child. She knew she should have killed the child, but she chose not to. Um, Now, I'm not saying Pharaoh's daughter was some awesome person or anything of that nature. It's simply the fact that maybe it was God who helped her take pity on this child and saved him from being killed. Perhaps Pharaoh's daughter didn't agree with what her father was doing, but really had no power to do anything to stop it. There's many different things here. We really don't hear about Pharaoh's daughter again after this, so we don't know what happens with her. Um, in any event, she did take pity on Moshe, and she did after. We'll talk about. Let me get to this first. So after she takes pity on the child and says wants to raise it and take it as her own, Moshe's sister comes along, takes advantage of the situation, says, "Hey, I can find somebody to nurse the boy for you until he's ready to be yours permanently." And Pharaoh's daughter agrees, and it happens to be Moshe's mother. And so Moshe's family actually benefits at least somewhat from this because the family's being paid to actually look over Moshe. So before that, if they would have kept Moshe without all this happening, they would have been taking care of him in the harsh conditions that the rest of Israel had to put up with. There wouldn't have been any extra support. In this way, they had at least some extra pay coming from Pharaoh's daughter to actually take care of this child. So they had some kind of benefit for us. So God kind of rewarded Moshe's family's faith in twofold. One, Moshe's mom got to actually take care of Moshe through his formative years. And two, they got to get paid for it. Okay, so now we come to the point where Moshe's old enough to actually be brought to Pharaoh's daughter and become her son. All right. Now, interesting enough, it says she named him Moshe. Now, Moshe in Hebrew means drawing out, but to Egyptians just means born. And it's kind of interesting there that the name that Pharaoh gave to Moshe has dramatic meaning in Hebrew, but really doesn't have much of a meaning at all in Egyptian. Now, it could have some kind of implications in Egyptian, maybe the fact that they're born from the Nile, or the fact that he stayed born, didn't die. But it seems that the Hebrew version of that name has a lot more meaning to it than perhaps the Egyptian one. But some questions here. So, how old was Moshe when he was given to Pharaoh's daughter? Was he was he 1, 2, 3? How old was he? And it seemed that's an important question here, because if Moshe was much older when he was given to Pharaoh's daughter, did he have a name prior to that? Did they always call him Moshe, or was he not given a name, or what happened? Now, in in Jewish culture, when a baby boy is circumcised, that is when he is given his name. We can see that way back clearly, even in the book of Yohanan, when he was when uh, Yohanan the baptizer was circumcised by Zechariah, his father. Um, that's an interesting story. You should go read that if you have a chance. Um, but um, but in this instance, we Pharaoh names him. So was he renamed by Pharaoh's daughter? Was Moshe the name always given to him, and then that um, maybe when he was presented, um, they told Pharaoh's daughter, hey, we've been calling him, we've named him Moshe, but you can do what you want. And Pharaoh's daughter decided to keep the name and name him Moshe. We don't know. Um, Whatever it happens to be, at that point, um, he was known as Moshe to all of Egypt and um, all of Israel. Okay, so now as Moshe got older, he eventually went out and saw his brothers and their burdens. Now Moshe always knew his Hebrew. He always knew his Hebrew. There wasn't. If you look here, if you look in the you look at the Prince of Egypt and movies like that, they're like, oh, he didn't know he was Hebrew. Um, but he did. He did know he was Hebrew. Um, Whether he knew it early on from when he was, from his raising of his mother, or if he didn't find out until later because he was given to Pharaoh's daughter at a young age and didn't remember. Whatever happened to be, he knew he was Hebrew. And so, but to Egypt, he was Egyptian. He was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. He was Egyptian. So Moshe went out and saw his brothers and their burdens. Now, it's kind of implied there that as he saw that, he felt kind of bad. If he knew he was Hebrew, here he is in the palace, and the rest of his brethren are out there being worked to death, literally, and beaten to death. Now, this is interesting because in the next part, in next scripture, we see where he sees an Egyptian beating one of his brethren. Now Moshe becomes so enraged that he kills this man and buries his body in the sand. Now this happens right after Moshe had watched his brethren at their burdens. So there was already a building in him, and we don't know how long this has been happening. But at that instance, it had kind of, I guess, reached an apex where he was filled with anger already and remorse and sorrow for what was happening to his brethren. And then this happens with the Egyptian attacking one of his brethren. So he's had enough, and he kills this Egyptian. Now, we read about and kind of hinted later that Moshe may have had some anger issues. He was the most humble man on earth. He was. Does not mean he was perfect. He did have anger issues. We see that and later on in the wilderness, we see where there are hints that he had issues with anger. Okay. Now, Moshe was a man who sought justice. He was a man of action. And so it could have been passion in him that kind of geared and veered more towards anger at some points. Passion can do that. It's like a fire. It can get out of control if it's not watched. So the question also is, couldn't he have stolen the Egyptians? So he is a prince of Egypt. He is a leader in Egypt. He should have had authority over an ordinary Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He could have said, hey, cut it out, or you're going to be punished, or I'm going to punish you, and hand him over to be punished. He didn't do that. He went ahead and killed him instead. Now, either one of two things that happened. One, his anger got the best of him, or two, this Egyptian was beating this Hebrew so bad that was at the point of killing the Hebrew, and the Moshe only thought the only thing he could do was kill the Egyptian to stop it. It was one of those two issues. In any event, the same kind of issue takes place the next day between two of his brethren, where one is beating the other. And so Moshe stops it and says, "Hey, why are you doing this?" And the guilty party basically says, "We know what you did. Are you going to kill me too? Like you killed the Egyptian?" Moshe finds out the deed is known, and then Pharaoh tries to kill him once he finds out. So Moshe has to run for it and get out of there, because now Pharaoh and all of his officers are all looking for Moshe to arrest and kill him. So Moshe flees into the wilderness and eventually arrives in Midian, which is well to the east of Egypt. Very interesting enough, it's the very same or a similar path that Israel would take to the same area and the same mountain. There's a mountain there. We'll talk about that in here in just a little bit. There's a mountain there that Israel will actually come to worship on. So almost a very kind of same path, or similar path at least, and that Moshe takes to Midian, to that mountain, is kind of the same path that is taken by Israel later when they leave Egypt. So he eventually arrives at a well. Now, let me explain to you what this wilderness he crossed was. And it's the same kind of descriptions we're going to get again later on in the Torah when it describes it. So this was a barren waste. It was hot. It was dry. It was full of dust and sharp rocks everywhere. There were scorpions. There were snakes. There were probably other things there that were dangerous. There was probably next to no food or water. It was a hellish place, and it still is today a hellish place. And so when he finished crossing this, and we don't know exactly how many days it was. I mean, it was probably weeks. It may have even been 40 days. It may have even been 40 days it took him to cross that wilderness. We don't know if he took water and food with him, or if he just left in the spur of the moment, took nothing with him. We don't know if he was able to find water scarce here and there, and food. We don't know if he was like out a survivalist where he knew what to do with all this. He was very learned back in Egypt. All of Pharaoh's household was very well learned. So he could have learned how to take care of himself in the wilderness. In any event, he shows up. He's probably exhausted. And so he sees his well. Excuse me. He sees his well, and is probably like absolutely so glad that there's this, of all things, almost like an oasis there in the middle of the wilderness for him. So he's probably taking a drink of water with what little strength he probably had left, and just resting and just trying to gather up his energy to keep going. Remember, at this point, Moshe really didn't have it wasn't really a plan of where to go. He was just heading east. Maybe in hope of running into a city or some people. We don't know. He was just running as far away from Egypt as he possibly could, fearing that he's going to be killed by Egyptians, Pharaoh's officers. So he's sitting there exhausted by the well, maybe having a drink of water, and these 7 shepherdesses show up. Now these are shepherdesses of the daughters of Reuel, or also who's also known as Jethro. You'll notice sometimes in Scripture that the same person is known by more than one name. In the case of Yaakov, he was actually given the name Israel by God. Here, we don't know. We do know that he was a priest of Midian. Um, we don't know if he worshipped the same God that Moshe did, or or worship the same God that Moshe's family did. We don't know. And that all really depends on when Moshe was given to Pharaoh's daughter of how much he had been taught. Um, and either way, Moshe finds out some things later on with God. We'll get into that here in just a minute. So these 7 shepherds are going out to water their flocks. I'm guessing they probably saw Moshe there, unless they had just gotten there and didn't have a chance to see Moshe. When these other shepherds show up and start driving off the shepherdesses so they could water their own flocks. I'm sure what you saw was a group of males who had their own, they were shepherds. They were all guys, obviously. They had their own flock, and being men, they knew they want to overpower the female shepherdesses and force their way. Moshe, again, ever being a man of action and justice, stands up, basically not having this, uses what little strength he probably has left to go ahead and not only fend off the shepherds who attack them, but then also helps the shepherds water their flocks as well. So even with the little strength Moshe had, he was still standing up for the little guy, so to speak, or little woman, and you know what I mean. So I found this kind of humorous. So the shepherdesses run off to tell their father what Moshe had done. And you notice there I say, well, where have we heard this before? Well, so you hear about this with Abraham's servant going to get a wife from Haran for Yitzchak, and now you also see the same thing later on. I'm trying to remember. My mind's went blank. But you see this more than once, where it happens for these women, and these women, they run off. Oh, with Yaakov. I'm so sorry. I can't believe I forgot that. With Yaakov also, happens same kind of deal. When he gets to Haran, he meets this woman, and she runs off and tells her family. Now here, Moshe helps out the shepherdesses, and they run off and go tell their father. And every time the men of the household or the people of the household are like, why did you just leave them there? Bring them here to get something to eat and drink and let them eat with us. It's kind of funny. I just find it really funny that that's the 3rd time now that's happened. It's kind of funny to me. So anyways, Moshe, they go back out and bring Moshe there, and Moshe obviously eats with them and fellowships with them. Remember, in the Middle East, hospitality is a huge deal. You do not leave people out in the middle of nowhere without offering them some place to eat and to stay and be hospitable, even if it's to your own detriment. Which actually implicates Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Because they didn't even offer the angels that had stayed in the square a place to stay. Only Lot did. So they were horrible in that instance to begin with. Anyways, so where was I? So Moshe stays on with the man. Say, hey, this is a nice place. It's a quiet life here. I can go ahead and live in peace. And he even takes a wife from Jethro. Is actually one of the shepherdesses that actually he met at the well. Her name is Zipporah. And she gives birth to a son named Gershon. And his name means an outsider there. So um, it's the testament to um, Moshe being an outsider in Midian when he's actually an Egyptian. So at this point, think about it for a minute. You put yourself in Moshe's shoes. He's a Hebrew. That's an Egyptian. That is now a Midianite. That's a conflict right there. That's a I don't know who I am moment. Okay, he wasn't the son of Pharaoh's daughter anymore. He was been cut off from that. He was an Egyptian. He is a Hebrew, and now he's a Midianite. Okay, so he's having some identity issues, or he doesn't know who he is. All right, all he knows is that he's got a peaceful life, raising flocks of sheep. Now, notice this. Here's another point to make here. Like David, and like Abraham and others, the leaders God chose were people who had already led flocks of some type. They had already led flocks of some type. They'd already been used to taking care of and raising other people, other animals, other people, whatever how you want to define flock. And so here in this instance, here we see Moshe is a shepherd basically and taking care of flocks. And so that's a kind of predecessor or a not predecessor, but a precursor to what is going to happen with him here in just a minute. Okay, so finally, the king of Egypt, who actually was the one who implemented the slavery, he's dead. Okay, another takes his place. All right. Now, at this point, when this new pharaoh takes over, God decides it's time to act. So, so God has his way, his reasons for why he allows things to go as long as they do and to go as intense as they do. And we'll start talking about some of those things here in a minute. But again, this was God said, okay, now it's time to act. All the people looking for Moshe are dead. That former king of Egypt is dead. Now it's time to go ahead and act and bring Israel out. So now we're in chapter 3. We start running to the very familiar narrative of Moshe encountering the burning bush. So this is also the first time we're introduced to the mountain of God called Horeb, which is also called Sinai as well. Horeb means desolation or desert. So this mountain was in the middle of an absolute desolation or desert. Now it's interesting because when we think about shepherding, when we think about shepherding flocks, we think of grassy fields and this beautiful lush landscape that they get to run around and eat and play and do. No, this is not how it was in the wilderness. They had to look for a long time, and these little tufts of grass were very scarce. And so they'd find a patch here and find a patch there. And it wasn't like your typical lush grass. It was like this harsh grass that was made for growing in a harsh environment. And so, and there were plants that grew in certain areas. There's something in the wilderness. There's something called wadis. Okay, and these wadis, what they are is where all the water from even from a great distance washes down and then eventually gathers in these little pools in different places, and that's where some of these plants grow. That's probably how Moshe kind of kept himself alive on his trek to Midian. Either way, so this is a very desolate, place. It just reinforces that. So, so you can imagine shepherding sheep, goats, or whatever he was shepherding in that place was very difficult. Um, it wasn't just send them loose, let them eat. No, he had to sit there. He had to guide them where to go. He had to watch over them, um, things of that nature, and so uh, it was pretty difficult. So there is argument, as everything else with the Bible, over the location of where Mount Horeb was actually located. The traditional location is a mountain in the Sinai Peninsula, usually in the southern Sinai Peninsula. But there's some who insist that it's actually in far northwestern, what's today now Saudi Arabia. It's close-ish to the area where Sinai might be geographically, but the traditional location is in the Sinai Peninsula. Now, there's questions about that because Midian is usually on some maps is shown over in that northwest area, and so that's where Midian is located, and that's where now. And I know I'm kind of jumping around here. It could be that Midian, their far western territory, or the very far western border, or of their territory, may have been stretched all the way over into the Sinai Peninsula. That's possible. But there's others who think that because Midian mostly was in the northwest part of Saudi Arabia, that was where Horeb was located. We also run into the name Horeb again, but it refers to a different mountain later on the Torah. So there is some argument over that. Honestly, in the long run, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the fact of what God did with Israel, or how they got to the promised land, or all they went through. That minor thing there does not matter. Yes, Horeb was very important. They received the law, the Torah there on Horeb. But as far as where it's actually located at, that's minor. All right. So when Moshe sees this site, he can't turn away from it. He sees this burning bush in the distance. Now, we're told that the angel of Adonai appeared in the flame of that bush, but the bush isn't burned. Moshe sees the flame from a distance, and he sees as the bush is not burning. And so he's like, naturally, anybody else, well, that's really weird. And then he's like, I'm going to go see why this bush isn't burning. That's how God got Moshe's attention. So, when Adonai sees he has Moshe's attention, he called to him, and Moshe replies just like his ancestors did, Hineni, or it literally means behold, but it also can be seen as here I am. So in other words, I'm presenting myself, here I am. Okay. What this shows is that Moshe automatically knew that he was talking with somebody with authority over him. Okay? So Adonai speaks to him and tells him, hey, this is holy ground. Don't come any closer. Take off your sandals. So Moshe does that. And because when Moshe realizes that this is God who he is speaking to, we'll see that here in a minute, he hides his face because he realizes, oh, this is not just somebody with authority over me. This is God himself. Now, again, you see where the angel Adonai is being conflated with being God. Why would that happen if it was just an angel? He is not just an angel of Adonai. he is another argument that he is Yeshua. He is a pre-incarnate Yeshua. He is before Yeshua was sent by the Father in human form. So anyways, it's also be a reason why why very often God wants to get people he talks to alone. So first of all, God chooses when and where he reveals himself to people, and it's usually in a very, very limited fashion. It's usually only with one, maybe two individuals. He is king, he is God, he is high and lifted up, and being presented with him is an absolute highest of privileges. Okay? So keep that in mind. He does not just reveal himself to anybody. He's very selective with who he reveals himself to. At least in person and appearing to them. And so just like Abraham, just like Yaakov, Moshe is now being privileged with speaking to God himself and seeing him as in the form of an angel. So now here's an interesting question. So again, I told you earlier, once God introduces himself as the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, whom obviously Moshe immediately recognizes those names. Again, that kind of leads credence to the fact that Moshe was at least old enough to be taught many things by Jochebed before he actually became Pharaoh's daughter's son. So why didn't God strike Moshe down? After all, we're told, and God said himself, no one sees God and lives. So, but we see here, Moshe has seen God and he still lives. Not only that, but Abraham was the same way, and so was Yaakov. And there are other instances, Ezekiel and others, who actually see God and still are alive. So there's an interesting thing there. Now, and even when Moshe sees him later, he only gets to see the fading glory of God as he passes by. So, is God able to represent himself in ways to where when you see him, you will not die? Is the ultimate spirit form of God, the ultimate form of God, so like that to where if you see that, you drop dead? Whereas God can present himself in another way to where he can interact with humanity without humanity dropping over dead. That kind of seems to be the thing here. And it also what happens to Yeshua. Yeshua is God and man. He is how God interacts with mankind without mankind dropping over. This is how we see here with the angel of Adonai. God had a way to mitigate people dropping down or dropping over because of his extreme holiness, the brightness of his purity, where he was able to go ahead and kind of encapsulate that behind something else. You also notice that God does the same thing. Excuse me. That's not my. But God, you also see the same thing when God comes down Mount Horeb. He surrounds himself with darkness to where his glory does not break out and destroy Israel and Moshe and Aaron and Yehoshua or Joshua. Okay, so let's move on. So God reveals that he's seen the whole time. He's not just all of a sudden, oh look, I forgot about Israel, man. Oh man, they're really getting treated like garbage down there, aren't they? I better go down and do something. That's not what happened here. God is not forgetful. Matter of fact, remember later on in the Tanakh, Elijah or Eliyahu makes fun of the prophets of Baal, making fun of how maybe he forgot or maybe he's on vacation and all these other things. So obviously, God does not forget. He does not see. He's not, he's not kind of where he only sees certain things. He's not like a man. He sees all things at once from eternity past to eternity future. He is God. And so he has known exactly what's happened with Israel the whole entire time. Now, obviously, he did not enjoy seeing the people of Israel be put through this. However, there obviously was a purpose for it. Okay? There was a purpose. And we're going to kind of see that in a little bit later on of what this purpose was. There's a purpose for why they were allowed to stay in Egypt for so long. First of all, if you remember reading, God talked to Abraham about the sin of the Amorites and the Canaanites of large not being full yet. This could probably also be applied to Egypt, where their sin was not full yet. And so God was making it to where they had done enough sin to where they were ready to be judged. God has a threshold which was, hey, I'm done. Okay? And then also it was a way for Israel to be tested, to be purged, purified, to be made ready to absolutely listen to whatever it needed to have God wanted them to do. They were being put in a place. Now you must say, well, that's harsh for God to allow people to die and to be treated so horribly to get to that point. It seems like that. But if Israel has started following the customs, at least some, I'm not saying all of them, but if some of them have started to follow, or a large part of them at least, maybe there was a remnant that kind of didn't, but maybe the large part of them started following Egyptian practices, becoming idolatrous and things of that nature, maybe it's another reason why they were kind of left there, because that had to be purged out of them, to where they realized there was no God but the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Okay? We don't like to talk about we have a tendency to not want to talk bad or to point out the flaws of the patriarchs, of Yisrael, of Moshe. We kind of hold them on a pedestal and we kind of look the other way with their flaws. But these were all men. These were all men. They were all people. They're human. They have flaws, just like everyone else. And so by overlooking those flaws and not talking about them, we're doing a disservice to ourselves. And I guarantee you, if these men were here and could talk themselves, they would actually tell you life lessons about what they went through and their own mistakes. They would have no qualms about doing that. And so we shouldn't be overlooking, we don't emphasize, but we don't overlook their character flaws, because they offer lessons to the rest of us. And if anything good had to come out of that, I'm sure Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were like, yes, please learn from me so you don't make the same mistakes. Okay. Now, the shocker comes when God wants to send him to do it. So God wants to send Moshe to go free all of Israel from Egypt. Now, I don't know if Moshe knew that all those were looking for him were dead already or not, but he's probably thinking, if he thinks they're still alive, he's probably thinking to himself, these guys want to kill me. Now you want me to go back and free my people from them? They're not going to listen to me. As far as people of Israel, the Egyptian officials are not going to listen to me. When I probably go back there, they're going to probably kill me on sight. That's probably all the things they're probably going through Moshe's mind. Now, so again, Moshe, out of humility, probably some fear, like we just talked about, but probably out of humility also, argues with God and says, hey, I'm nobody. Pharaoh won't listen to me. Excuse me for a minute. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. My children were being quite rude, interrupting this, and I truly apologize for that. Let's move on. Um, so, um, so again, Moshe is talking, saying, "I'm nobody. Pharaoh won't listen to me." Um, and the people may not, or the people may not believe me, or he might say, who's sending you? Prove to us that you were sent by God. Who sent you? And so Moshe offers all them. So God tells Moshe, hey, I'll be with you. One of the signs that I really have sent you is that you will worship me on this mountaintop along with all of Israel. And so at this very mountain. So he also tells Moshe what to say to Pharaoh. So he talks to um, Moshe and says, you're going to go ahead and tell Pharaoh that you want to go on a 3-day trek into the wilderness to sacrifice to me. Now, that's interesting because we know what the whole purpose of this is, to get Israel out of Egypt permanently. So why would God tell Moshe to tell Pharaoh, hey, you're going to leave for a 3-day trek and then just to work to sacrifice? Now, notice Moshe, when he actually goes to Pharaoh, says to Pharaoh, and even God here doesn't say anything about returning. They just say they're going to a 3-day trek to sacrifice him in the wilderness. So our first thing is, well, isn't that kind of deceitful? Because if the whole purpose is to permanently leave, why would you tell Pharaoh only 3 days? So now again, it's a whole thing leaving open that there was nothing said about them returning. It was only about the 3-day trek. And so this is very difficult. I've been actually kind of chewing over this, and the only thing I can make of it is that the open-endedness of the request lets Pharaoh believe whatever he wants to believe. If he wants to believe they're coming back, then that's fine, or not. Regardless of what Moshe says to Pharaoh, God knows that Pharaoh's not going to agree to begin with. It's kind of a moot point, because when he goes to say this to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's not going to let them leave no matter what. So regardless of what's actually said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's not going to agree. And so whenever Pharaoh does not agree, God's going to use it, force the issue. He's going to perform great wonders that will overwhelm Pharaoh, overwhelm Egypt, prove that Egypt's gods are nothing, that Pharaoh himself is not a god, and that and so where he'll actually let Israel eventually go. Not only will he let him go, but according to the scripture and further on in Exodus, he will force him out with a great hand. Please, I want you out. Leave now. Not just you're free to go, but leave. God will grant Israel such favor with the Egyptians. They will be such fearful of Israel. They will actually allow the women of Israel to go ahead and request silver, gold, and clothing from them, and they'll just give it all to them. So they'll plunder all of Egypt before they leave. Now, you may say, well, that's kind of harsh. Well, Egypt kind of owes them back pay. Okay? They've basically been working for free as in harsh conditions being brutally mistreated by the Egyptians for decades. Okay, um, and so now they are going to get what's owed them um, through plundering Egypt. So what Egypt's getting here, they kind of deserve. They've been living high. They've been living high, you know, uh, having everything, having the Israelites provide food for them and do all these other kind of things for them. Now it's time to pay up. All right, so we're in chapter 4 now, and we start going to more of Moshe's objections and excuses. So he says to them, look, they're not going to listen to me or believe me. I'm not a man of words. I've never been a man of words. I get tongue-tied, or however, I'm not very good with language. Whatever was going through Moshe's mind, he talked about he's slow to speak. Um, maybe he's not good at speaking in front of people. Um, whatever happens to be, and eventually he just says, please just send someone else. Now, God at first says, look, here's some signs you show them so they'll believe you. They'll turn the staff into a snake, then it'll turn back to a staff again. You can put your hands on your cloak and pull it out, have zarat, which is a skin disease, and then put it back in and be made whole again. And if they don't believe their first two, then you can take some water from the Nile, pour in the ground, and it'll turn into blood. So, and so, this is when Moshe said, "Hey, I'm not a man of words," and God's like, "Well, who made man? Who made his mouth? Who made people deaf? Who made all these things? Was it not me? I?" He said, "Now go. I'll be with you." And God said, "I'll teach you what to say." And then Moshe argues again to send someone else, and he goes, "Look, Aharon is your brother. He's coming to see you. He will be your mouthpiece, and you will be like God to him, and you will tell him what to speak to Pharaoh and to the people of Israel." And so, eventually, Moshe decides to go. Now you notice that God was angry here. Eventually, he got angry with Moshe because of his excuses and his lack of faith. And so even Moshe had a lack of faith, where he didn't trust God enough to just go and do what God said. But eventually he did do it. Now, it's a lesson for all of us. God does not give up on a person if they still want to do the right thing, but do not have the courage or confidence at first to do it. That's what happened with Moshe here. It wasn't that Moshe didn't want to go free his people. It was the fact that they're not going to believe me. They're not going to listen to me. And I'm not good at speaking and, things of that nature. Moshe's issue was not with going to do it. It was with him thinking he had what it took to get it done. And he didn't. If he went without God, it never would have happened. God made it plain that I'm the one who's going to make you successful, not you. I'll be with you. I'll teach you. You have these signs. I will make you successful. And so eventually Moshe does what was right, gets over his fear, gets over his lack of faith, and does what's right, and does what God wants. He's obedient. And so God didn't he got frustrated and angry with Moshe, but he was also patient with Moshe, and Moshe eventually just went along with God's plan. Okay, so Moshe goes to Jethro, requests, hey, I need to go back to Egypt. I need to check on my people and see how they're doing. Jethro doesn't argue at all. He tells him to go in peace. There's not even a qualm about it at all. Just like, sure, go in peace. Okay? Again, we don't know if Jethro worshipped the same God. Um, it's kind of hinted at later on in Shemot that he does, but we don't know for sure. Or at least have the same beliefs about this God. But if it's kind of hinted at that way, and with the ease with Jethro lets Moshe go, it kind of hints at that. Hey, I know that this is something God wants you to do, or I can sense that something God wants you to do, and you're on a mission. So in any event, Jethro lets them go. So now Moshe again, he can return to Egypt because these men are dead. And this is one of the things that why God says it's time to do it. It's very similar because if you look at what happened to Yeshua, Yeshua was able to return to the land of Israel after the men seeking his death were dead, after King Herod is dead. And now you can see Moshe return to Egypt to get his people out of there because the king of Egypt and people seeking him are dead. It's an interesting parallel there. All right, so Moshe takes a staff that God wanted him to use to perform the miracles, and his family, and is set off for Egypt. Now, the staff he has is a shepherd's staff. It is not like the staff that Egypt has. The staff Egypt has is a staff of power, of cruelty, of uh, brutal commands. That is not the staff of a shepherd. The staff of a shepherd is guiding, and can be used to protect, things of that nature. So this staff was an important symbol because it symbolized the difference, the stark difference between God and the gods of Egypt. And we'll see more of that later on as well with the staff. So God tells Moshe again what to say to Pharaoh when he gets there. That it's something different. He goes, tell Pharaoh to release my firstborn Israel, and if he does not, I will kill his firstborn. All right. So now we come to an interesting it's kind of like some interesting kind of insertion. Like you're running through this narrative of him going to Egypt, and all of a sudden you get thrown into the mix this little narrative here. So Moshe and Zipporah and their son and whatever they brought with them, the staff and other things, they're going on their way to Egypt, and along the way God meets Moshe and is going to kill him. And we see that Zipporah, circumcises Gershon, and then God leaves him alone. And it calls Moshe a bloody husband because of what she had to do to Gershon. So obviously Zipporah did not want Gershon circumcised. We don't know why. It could be she didn't want to hurt him. Maybe because it wasn't their custom in Midian. Could be several different ways why, but she refused to allow it to be done. So Moshe kind of, maybe he kind of kicked the can down the road and said, "Oh, well, we'll get it done." I don't know what was going through Moshe's mind, but if whatever the case was, it never got done. And so God basically forced the issue. Said, "You're going to do it, or you're going to die." Why? Because how could Moshe return to Egypt and be used to free the people and to later receive the Torah and teach to others and uphold it if he himself wasn't upholding the most basic of commandments for the people of for the descendants of Abraham to circumcise every male. So after this, after that short little insertion there, now we're back to, God tells, Aharon to meet Moshe in the wilderness. So now it's kind of interesting because, the slavery hasn't stopped. The brutal treatment hasn't stopped. And it's only Aharon who goes to meet Moshe in the wilderness. You don't hear anything about his wife or his own kids. And so, did God make a way for Aharon to escape to go see Moshe on his own? Did Aharon tell his family, "Hey, look, God appeared to me. He said I need to go meet Moshe in the wilderness. I have to go, and I'll be back." Um, we don't know. We do know from here on out that Aharon is with Moshe, and it doesn't appear that he continues to work the to actually be a slave like the rest of the people. Like it's almost like he's now with Moshe, and wherever Moshe goes, he goes. So Aharon meets Moshe in the wilderness. They have they embrace each other. They're happy to see each other again. Moshe probably hasn't seen them in a long time. Maybe we don't know. I mean, maybe Moshe was allowed to see them every so often as being uh, the Pharaoh's daughter's son. Maybe he was allowed to go see their son. Maybe he did see them. Um, we don't know. It doesn't say anything about that. It just says that he's presented to her and becomes Pharaoh's son. From then on, he's Pharaoh's daughter's son. But we don't know if he actually is able to eventually every so often come visit them. We don't know. In any case, it could have been because Moshe was gone so long. It's been 40 years. Moshe, when he left Egypt, was 40, and now he's 80. So it's been a long time. Aharon's even a little bit older than him. So another really interesting thing. So Aharon's doing the same thing Moshe did, only he's in his, early 80s. When Moshe was 40. So you can imagine the fortitude and the blessing and things that God must have given Aharon to allow him to make that trek across that wilderness to come see Moshe. Now, we don't know how far Moshe was in the wilderness before he actually met up with Aharon. It could have been half the distance. We don't know. So maybe Aharon didn't have to go quite that distance. But even so, it still must have been hard on him being in his 80s. Anyway, so Moshe tells him all that God told him to say, and also the signs they were supposed to show Pharaoh. So after this, Aharon and Moshe arrive in Egypt, and they go immediately to go speak to the elders of Israel, and they tell them what God said, and then they show them the signs. And after doing this, the people believed and they worshipped. So they're happy, they're excited because now there's a possibility that they're leaving, that they're going to leave Egypt and be free from being slaves. Now, this is just the elders here. They didn't talk to the rest of the people. It was just to the elders. And so we don't know. So maybe the elders were still following God very closely, but the younger generations had kind of drifted off and started to follow idolatrous things. That could be part of another aspect of what's happening here. Okay, so Moshe goes to Pharaoh and tells him exactly what God tells him to do. But Pharaoh says, "I do not know this God of yours, and nor will I let Israel go." They're staying put. They're not leaving. So Moshe then goes on to explain, says, "Hey, we need to go. We need to go worship. We need to go sacrifice to our God, or something bad may happen to us." Okay, and Moshe's not lying there. If they disobey God, something bad may happen to them. But Pharaoh again jumps right to the whole thing of, this is ridiculous. You're here. Your presence here is doing nothing but slowing them down. You're getting them to believe in deceptive words. These people are already numerous enough as it is. I'm trying to control their population. Here you are trying to make things easy on them. And it all goes back to the whole thing of Pharaoh being afraid of them overthrowing him and Egypt as a whole. That's the sole focus. If you're going through this, it's the sole focus of Pharaoh. first of all, he said, I don't know this God, nor will let Israel go. Pharaoh thinks of himself as a god. They look at him as a god. He looks at himself as all powerful, and he will not be threatened by he will not be threatened by the large group of Israel that potentially take over his kingdom. And so after this, Pharaoh just says they're lazy. They're lazy. They're believing all this stuff because they're lazy. So they're no longer going to be given straw to make bricks. Although they're going to make the same amount of bricks they always make, they're not going to be given any straw. And in his mind, that'll make them so busy they can't think about things, and they can just focus on nothing but work. So the people are told what to do, and the foremen, and so they go along. They're trying to make bricks out of straw, and all of a sudden, the foremen get called in. They're beaten by the Egyptian officers, and they're beaten because the slaves are not meeting their quota. And the foremen are like, they can't make bricks out of straw. They're not finding enough straw. They're not able to meet the quota because they can't work in these conditions. And the officers are basically like, take it with Pharaoh. You have a problem with it, take it up with Pharaoh. So the foremen go to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh reiterates. It says the people of Israel are lazy. That's why this is happening. This is happening because they're lazy and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And they have time to believe fairy tales and deceptive things. So after this whole interaction, the people saw they were in big trouble, and they were basically, as it says in Scripture, the sword was being put to them. Because if they didn't meet their quota, Pharaoh was going to have reason to start killing a lot of them off. And so they blamed Moshe and Aaron for it. They said, may God judge you for what's happening to us, that you're causing all this trouble for us. So Moshe goes back and says, hey, God, what gives? Why are you allowing all this evil to happen to Israel? You said you were going to free them, and now all there's more trouble happening for them. But God tells them now, both Pharaoh, Egypt, and Israel will see how I will act mightily to free my people. And so that ends in chapter 6. I hope this was a blessing to you. I hope it kind of opened up and unpacked a lot of what was in the first couple of chapters of Shemot. Yes, they probably could have gone a lot longer with that, but that is a good amount of information to give you all. You can actually study for yourself. Please study for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. Allow the Spirit to speak to you through the Scriptures, so that you can continue to grow along with me in our understanding of them and the lessons they have to teach us and the truths God has to teach us. Okay, so as always, if you have prayer, please do not hesitate to go ahead and send that email address there. I'll be more than happy to pray for you or whoever you want me to pray for. Please only give first names. Don't give me any personal identifiable information. And you can just be succinct with. You don't have to give me every detail. Just enough for me to pray for you with. Again, I do apologize earlier for the interruption. Guys, when I'm making these videos, I'm actually doing this here at my house. My family's usually around, and sometimes my kids get a little rambunctious, kind of like y'all's probably do. And I have to sometimes go down there and get them to calm down. Today was kind of especially one of those things where they were getting really loud, and I apologize for me getting a little bit angry, but it was quite rude of them. And anyways, you guys deal with that stuff at your houses. I'm sure with your children, you know what it's like. So anyways, brachot to you, shalom, and I will see you next time.